There is a strange, almost universal temptation to look back at the things that terrified us as kids and ask if they were ever actually real. In 2006, a 20-year-old college student and his cousin, Mike, decided to find out. They were living in Austin, Texas, balancing school and work while staying at their grandparents' home. At 2 a.m., driven by a mix of boredom and memory, they drove 3 miles to Mike's old neighborhood. They wanted to see the house that had haunted their early years, hoping to prove the terrors they remembered were just the products of an overactive childhood imagination. When they arrived, the property appeared utterly desolate. The grounds had been surrendered to a riot of overgrowth. Sticking out of the untamed weeds was a for sale sign, a striking irony considering both were intimately acquainted with the history that necessitated its sale. They decided to slip inside. Gaining entry required little effort, as the specific window leading directly into Mike's former childhood bedroom had been left completely unlatched. It felt less like a lucky break and more like a silent invitation. Slipping through the frame, they were hit by a jarring sensory clash. The sharp, clean scent of fresh paint and new timber collided with the damp, heavy smell of the original masonry. That familiar stone seemed to radiate the exact same dread they remembered from their youth. Navigating this dark, silent space carried a weight that went beyond property trespass. Every floorboard creak felt like a challenge, turning their late-night excursion into a deliberate confrontation with a house that seemed to remember their presence. The living room was the site where the atmosphere supposedly curdled into something far more sinister. In an ill-conceived attempt to face their fears, the pair decided to unlock the door leading to the garage, intending to peer into the lightless void of the attic above. The moment the deadbolt yielded with a sharp metallic pop, the heavy door was violently flung open. Beyond it lay an impenetrable, pitch-black void. Mike remained motionless, paralyzed by a vacant stare into the gloom. Instantly, the house shifted. Every kitchen cupboard stood agape. The drawers were extended to their limits. In a single moment, an unseen force had simultaneously thrown open every door and cabinet throughout the residence. From the shadowed aperture of the attic, a figure descended with a sickening fluidity. It was a diminutive, hunched form, perhaps 5 feet tall. It hit the ground, pivoted with unnatural speed, and charged directly at the cousins with a primal force. The impact sent them both reeling to the floor. As the spectral presence traversed through the narrator's physical form, he was overtaken by an agonizingly cold sensation. It left behind a visceral nausea and a lingering aura of malice. The entity vanished out the primary exit, and the residence erupted into a cacophony of slamming doors, flickering lights, and rushing water. The cousins scrambled to their feet and began a frantic, breathless retreat to their vehicle. Their attempt to rationalize a childhood fear had backfired. They had triggered a massive, territorial rejection from an entity capable of violent physical manipulation. They drove through the neighboring streets until the intensity of their terror subsided into a manageable unease. Still in a state of bewilderment, they sought to validate what they had just witnessed and resolved to find the apparition once more near a nearby creek bridge. As they descended toward the waterline, Mike's foot caught on something in the brush. The hillside was covered in a macabre tableau, a multitude of primitive crosses, fashioned from scorched twigs and bound tightly with twine in a repetitive figure-8 pattern. The narrator grabbed one of the artifacts, but Mike suddenly shouted. Hobbling up the opposing hillside with a rhythmic, labored gait was the entity. She wore a heavy wool cloak, her leaden gray hair secured in an antiquated bun. Her face possessed a youthful quality, but her gaze carried a malevolent distortion. The figure dissolved into the darkness, but a low, resonant moan began to rise from the creek basin. It was a sound of profound, performative grief, a wailing manifestation that moved along the water, carrying both a jagged scorn and a bottomless sorrow. They tracked the sound downstream and stepped into the thickets bordering the waterline, but a sudden silence descended. As they turned to retreat, they found their path obstructed. The entity stood rooted between them and the car, Her fists clenched as she fixed them with a hateful stare. Mike took a tentative step backward, and her fury ignited. She unleashed a piercing scream and lunged forward with explosive speed, her hand lashing out with irresistible force. The narrator narrowly evaded the strike, but Mike was hit. He later described the touch of her hand as having the frigidity of glacial ice, causing his entire body to surrender to a momentary numbness. As her nails carved into his face, he said his flesh felt as though it were being rent with the fragility of a linen sheet. The entity's sorrow had curdled into a jagged fury. By blocking their retreat and waiting for them to move first, she had transformed their curiosity into a violent physical confrontation. The entity had carved 4 profound lacerations across Mike's face. The trail of violence extended from beneath his right ear, across his cheek, and terminated near his mouth. The encounter had firmly crossed from the supernatural into physical reality. The following morning, the narrator went to his vehicle to retrieve the small twig cross he had taken from the hillside, hoping to examine the evidence when his mind was no longer clouded by anxiety. The artifact had vanished. In its place, he discovered the carcass of a rattlesnake, draped across the center console in a state of macabre repose. This substitution served as a final, decisive warning. The cousins resolved to never return, but the questions remained. How was every door in the house opened at once? Where did the twig crosses come from? And what was the identity of the person this woman was mourning with such bitterness? To this day, the original provenance of the name Mommy Ego remains a mystery. Even though the cousins now live several states away, the memory of that night persists as a source of bewilderment. They are left with the knowledge that some boundaries, once crossed, leave a permanent mark. There is a chilling suspicion that Mommy Ego remains cognizant whenever her narrative is recounted. It serves as a reminder that some childhood monsters are fiercely real, waiting to violently reject anyone who tries to exhume their past.